Hey, what's up guys, Craze here, back in Anthem, and today we have a special video that was made possible thanks to the awesome people over at Nvidia. They hooked me up with an RTX 2080 Ti to test the new DLSS feature that was recently added in Anthem. I believe it was with update 1.04 when this new feature was added, and of course, just to spice things up, I went in with a huge upgrade around it and I bought a 9900K CPU, 32 gigs of DDR4 and some other cool stuff to test things out properly. And of course, if you want to see the best results at the highest quality, then I suggest you guys watching this video in 4K for that extra crispiness. Now the plan for today is rather simple, and it is to check out this new feature on this setup, see what changes it brings, and most importantly, if it's even worth it. So let's not waste any more time and get things started. Now some of you might be asking yourselves, what is even this DLSS thing that I keep talking about? Well, DLSS stands for Deep Learning Super Sampling, which is this new tech Nvidia added with their most recent RTX 2000 series. It basically uses the power of AI to boost your frame rates in graphically intensive video games so that you can run them at much higher resolutions and settings while still maintaining solid frame rates. There's a lot of technical stuff in there that you can go ahead and read. I've provided some links in the description box, but let's start things off with some of the stuff that you need to keep in mind before proceeding. First, you need to keep in mind that DLSS is available for the entire RTX 2000 lineup at resolutions of 1440p or 4K. Second of all, the game that you're playing also needs to support this new feature, and luckily enough, Anthem does so for about a week or so now. Nonetheless, once that was up and running and I had everything set up, I began doing some tests, and by that I mean a ton of tests. Of course, everything in the game has been turned to the absolute maximum possible setting, so everything here is on ultra high settings. And the first area that I started in was in Fort Tarsis, specifically the bazaar area, as this one packed a nice amount of NPCs, tons of environmental props, a lot of puddles, reflections, some great lighting as well as shadows, and it was all around quite taxing on my 4K resolution on this system. I was only able to run this scene at around 53 frames per second, which is still very good considering it's 4K, but I wanted more. So check what happens when I activate DLSS in the graphics options, and here you go. It's basically a significant boost of over 10 FPS just from activating this one feature at no additional cost. As you will soon come to find out, there are other places where you'll gain up towards 20 additional FPS just from it, and for example, another beautiful location I was able to find, also very taxing, was the fountain area around the fort. Of course, this scene provides an all-around amazing lighting. Each individual leaf in the water has its shadows rendered in a very realistic manner, so of course it was very taxing on my system. And with all of the vegetations around here and the NPCs in the background and the other stuff in the background as well, the FPS here was around 49, so pretty low, even lower than the previous one. But once DLSS got activated, that went all the way up to 66, a substantial 17 FPS gain that got me by surprise at this point, because I initially thought and didn't really have big expectations for this new tech. But yeah, this was a more than pleasant surprise, and I'm glad I was able to test it out. Of course, since I heard about the feature causing blur problems for some people, I also went in and tested that out on the textures and the overall image quality. So I've checked everything imaginable, prioritizing scenes and textures that were offering a lot of great details that would normally get blurred when graphical settings would have problems. So I started with a straight shot of the ground textures and compared the results to one another. In this scene, for example, you can see the rocks outlined, the small cracks and wetness, which seems to have been fully kept once the DLSS was activated, so I am not seeing any blur problems here at all. I have also tested this on the Legion of Dawn mural, and I'm glad to report that every individual carved detail, all of the lines and textures have been fully kept. Even the smallest carvings were unaffected, while my FPS gain was significant. So all around, every single bit of detail that I once had without DLSS is also there when it's activated. Now of course the still images are all great and show some really great detail that was put into Anthem, but it's time to take things outside of Fort and check how it's all behaving under real gameplay conditions. Depending on how packed the environment around me was and how many trees and vegetation the game had to render in my proximity, the frame rate would go anywhere between 55 all the way down to even 41 or 42 in the most intensive areas, and of course this was with DLSS being turned off. Still, I was so impressed with how gorgeous the game looks in 4K compared to my old setup that I didn't even notice this frame drop, and honestly you don't even feel these frame drops. I mean 45 frames per second is still good, it's still smooth as long as it doesn't drop below 30. Now the biggest dip in terms of FPS that I was able to record was when I went underwater in a certain area, and this brought me all the way down to 35, so a pretty big change over there. But once DLSS was activated, the change was immediate, and this time around I was able to maintain an almost solid 60 FPS and above in almost all areas. While flying around and dive bombing just like before, I was able to now maintain 63 FPS. Meanwhile, the most intensive vegetation areas were pulling me back down to 59, 58 at times. Even the underwater section from earlier now had a massive 20 FPS boost from just around 35 previously to 55, so a pretty significant gain. And all around I would say that DLSS in Anthem, outside of the small hiccup I had activating it, behaved absolutely amazing. It improved my frame rates while still maintaining that 4K resolution at everything else maxed out in the game. So what this means is that the biggest gain in terms of FPS that you're ever going to see is when you're averaging below 60 and also at very high resolutions. That is why I initially had to set up the game's resolution at 4K on the 2080 Ti. 2K simply didn't cut it, and I was able to already run the game at 90 FPS in those resolutions, which meant that there was no reason for DLSS to even kick in and do anything. The way this tech is made is to boost those frame rates at these precise high GPU workloads when your graphics card is almost fully utilized. This means that running low resolutions and high frame rates will not really see any benefit for DLSS, which is why you'll most probably see it grayed out. Now of course, with all of this being said and done, what is now my opinion on DLSS, and is it even worth it as a feature? Well, at least for the second one, I think the results speak for themselves. When playing at 1440p or 4K resolutions, there is absolutely no reason for you to not activate this feature, as the benefits you get from it in terms of performance are simply too good to let aside. Of course, this is if you already own an RTX card. The only exception to this rule would be, for example, if your game doesn't support it, or if there is a bug that currently prevents you from using it. But as long as you have the hardware for it and you have an RTX card in your computer and a monitor to go along with it, then definitely go ahead and use this feature. There's not a single reason for you to hold back, especially if you're running at very high resolutions. Now if you have a 144Hz monitor like me and play at lower resolutions than 4 or 2K, well, things can start becoming a little bit more complicated. Here is when it all becomes to be a matter of preference. You can play the game at 1080p, for example, and 144Hz and get some really awesome benefits from that very smooth and high FPS, but suffer in terms of graphical quality. On the other side, if you have one that supports 2K or 4K natively, then these resolutions or an upscale to 4K with DLSS might be a better option. In my case, on my setup, I am able to run 2K at about 80-90 FPS, and I can also turn it down to 1080p to run at even higher FPS, but that wouldn't really make any sense on a 27-inch screen that I have, and it would definitely lose some quality, which means that at least in my case, upscaling it to 4K and activating DLSS was the overall better option. I'm still able to run above 60 FPS in like 90% of the scenarios, sometimes even 70 or 80 FPS even during combat, but I do get that sweet graphical detail, which I find myself now unable to go back from. So all in all, again, a matter of preference, and you also need to check out what your hardware is, what are your current limitations, and what your screen is like to make a proper assessment. So hopefully this video helped you guys out. Again, a massive shout out to Nvidia for hooking me up with this beast of a GPU, but that is all that I have for now. Now, of course, if you enjoyed this video, then you know what to do. Leave a thumbs up, subscribe, comment down below, you know, the good stuff, and I'll see you guys next time. So peace out.